Hi everybody, this is Brendon Baillod from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. I hope everybody's hunkered down at home, much as I am here in my house with all my books and antiquities in my collection. I don't have it so bad. I have a list of projects that I'm trying to get done and a lot of research and writing that I'm working on. But while I was here, I thought, since I imagine a lot of you are probably also sort of hunkered down and looking for entertainment, I thought I'd do a little piece about another piece of important Great Lakes maritime history original research material that I make a lot of use of. And obviously when I look at shipwrecks, you can go and read books that other people have written, but those books are often written many years ago, and those people often didn't have access to all the resources that we do now. So when I want to find out what really happened to a ship, I go back to original primary source documentation like this. These are the annual reports of the U.S. Life Saving Service, and they're really important if you want to really get first-person accounts of what really happened in a marine disaster on the Great Lakes. So I'll give you a little bit of background on this. The Life Saving Service was really formally developed in 1878 on the Great Lakes, and there had been life-saving stations all around the country, but they were volunteer stations prior to that, and they were, staffed sometimes, other times not, and with the tremendous increase in vessel traffic on the coasts and on the lakes in the 1870s, the need for a formal life-saving service was really obvious. So the government got into the business and started the U.S. Life Saving Service. Initially, there were about 38 stations on the Great Lakes. They were broken up into districts, districts 9, 10, and 11. I think 9 was the Eastern Lakes, 10 was Superior and Huron, and then 11 was Lake Michigan. Later they changed the numbering so that the Great Lakes were districts 10, 11, and 12. And some stations, came and went, but generally speaking, there was in the neighborhood of 40 stations on the Great Lakes, usually around Great Lakes ports where accidents were common, or around notorious places like Beaver Island, where ships often came to grief and needed the assistance of rescuers. So what kind of records do we have from the Life Saving Service? Well, there are quite a few different types. The thing that are probably the most valuable, but the hardest to get at, are the station logs. Every Life Saving Service station kept a log, a daily log, and those logs are preserved at the National Archives. Really interesting records to read. A number of them have been copied and microfilmed and are available at regional collections, but really the whole collection is only in one place, and that's at the National Archives. The other thing that the Life Saving Service produced were wreck reports. These are wreck reports not unlike the Customs House wreck reports, and in fact they're a little more detailed in some cases. But they're different. They're longer. They give a long-form narrative, kind of longhand description. I'll show some of these documents here as I'll put them up on the screen. The wreck reports are also at the National Archives. They're not easy to come by. Some libraries and museums have made copies of those for their local life-saving station. There's also a correspondence file for the Life Saving Service at the National Archives, some of which has been microfilmed. A lot of those are lists of vessels that wrecked in given districts, and those files are interesting. But really what we have, the main durable record we have, are the annual reports of the U.S. Life Saving Service. And these were bound volumes that were produced every year between 1878 and 1914. In 1915, the Life Saving Service was absorbed into the Coast Guard. So a couple of caveats for the use of Life Saving Service records for doing maritime history research. Probably the biggest one is that the records only exist between 1878 and 1915. Prior to that, 1878, there was no Life Saving Service, and after that we get the Coast Guard. This is an annual report of the Coast Guard. It's blue as opposed to black. It's got a lot less information in it. It does have some wreck information in it, though. So these are useful, but they only ran for, I think, a few more years in this form with much information in them. So, the other thing to keep in mind when using Life Saving Service records are that they only cover accidents that the Life Saving Service was involved in. So if an accident happened out in the middle of the lake, it's very unlikely that a Life Saving Service station would have been involved in it if it was 100 miles away out in the middle of the water. So really, if you know a wreck happened near a given station or near a given port, chances are they were called, or that they would have mentioned it in their logs in some capacity. But the vast majority of wrecks that happened out in the wilderness or on remote shores will not have any mention in these resources. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the calls that are mentioned in these books are to small pleasure craft. They're not all, major shipwrecks. So you do end up going through quite a lot of interesting local material, is what I call it. There were frequent flyers, usually inexperienced yacht owners, wealthy Victorian men who were out gallivanting when they ought not have been. You find a lot of that in here. You find a lot of local history, people falling off of docks and drowning. A lot of interesting genealogical material, frankly. So they're useful for more than just maritime history research. And a lot of the reports are just really rendering assistance to commercial vessels. So, for example, we have one of a schooner that lost its anchor chains. It paid out all its anchor chains off Beaver Island in deep water, and the chains were still attached to the boat. I shouldn't say it lost them, but they needed the help of the life-saving service to raise the anchors because there was like 600 feet of anchor chain, and it was really hard to get that in. So oftentimes it was just helping out sailors who had need of help. So one of the interesting things about the life-saving service that gives us so much consistency and continuity in their records is the fact that they had the same superintendent for all 40-some years of their existence, and that was Sumner Kimball. Sumner Kimball was a real freak for stats and numbers, and he had them make these extremely detailed reports. And we have him to thank, I think, in some ways for the amount of maritime history that we have here. I'll give you a tour of this with some photos that I'll put up. But a couple of caveats then about using the reports. So one of the things that not a lot of people know, if you don't have a full run of these, are that the early years always came in two different versions. So the 78, 79, 80, and 81 reports came in both an abridged version and an unabridged version. The abridged version just has the narratives of vessels where there was loss of life. It does not have the more detailed service calls, which is what you want. So if you're wanting to buy these and you look for the 1881 and you see that it's only 250, 230 pages, it's not worth that much. You want the big one, and these are hard to come by for the early years. But then they started to make, a full unabridged version after that, which is kind of what we want. The later years got much thinner, mostly because, frankly, the life-saving service was called on less and less, and the nature of their calls changed, which is partially why they were absorbed into the Coast Guard. So let's talk about what's in these books. I'm going to use the 1898-99 report as an example of what we want to look at here. And you might not be able to see what I'm showing you, but that's okay because I'm going to put these up on the screen. So probably the most interesting thing that we have that everyone sees when they look at the Life-Saving Service annual reports are what are known as the loss of life narratives. So the first third, in some cases the first half of the book, is long written narratives, sometimes very dramatic narratives, of calls where a loss of life happened. And in this particular book, there's a pretty good one. It's the wreck of the steamer Lawrence, which happened at Point Betsy. And the reason it's mentioned is because the second mate lost his life in sort of an ill-considered attempt to try to get ashore. And the life-saving service was there rescuing them. It's a very dramatic rescue. The narrative takes about 3 pages in here, and it's very detailed. It mentions names. It mentions really a lot of heroism by the life-saving service. And there are many of these. In this particular year, the majority of them were on the coasts. There was a huge storm at Cape Cod, many losses of life there, many shipwrecks. And you can read many pages of just harrowing disaster after disaster. The other things that are in the Life-Saving Service annual reports are mostly statistics. You come through and there's a lot of tables of information that's probably less interesting. But the next thing we come upon that's really quite interesting is what's known as the services of crews. And the services of crews section is particularly interesting because it tells you exactly what happened on every call. The one I'm going to use as an example from this year's one I know well. It's the loss of the schooner Winona and James C. King at, really just the Winona, at the north entry to the Keweenaw waterway on Lake Superior. So I'm going to read this to you. This is an example of the detail that they give you for, and this is just a regular call, no loss of life here. At 11 p.m., while the steamer Garden City was trying to make the piers with these two schooners in tow, she got too far to leeward, and both of them grounded. The King was near the pier, and the station crew arriving about that time, they got out her lines and made her fast. She was released the next morning by a tug and was towed inside the piers, apparently undamaged. The Winona went so far up on the beach that the lifesavers could not get their boat between her and the shore. So they got a ladder and had it made fast by one end to the fore rigging, and as the crew came down, the surfmen carried them ashore and took them to the station, where they remained until the next day. Such of them as needed dry clothes were fitted out from the supply of the Women's National Relief Association. Surfmen worked with the crew of a tug for a week, trying to dredge a channel deep enough to release the Winona, but had to give up the undertaking. And I know this accident pretty well. In fact, I'll put up there's a couple of really dramatic pictures of her on the beach that I'll throw up here. And the captain actually spent the winter on her, lived on board. And the next spring he had to leave because the ship started to break up. She is at the present day site of McLean State Park. I believe her remains are completely gone now, or they're inundated by sand. Let's take a look at the next section. But just before we move, the services of crews is really a large section. It's not by district, it's just by date. So it's every call that the life-saving service went on, day by day by day by day, anywhere in the United States. And so it gives you the detail. But the next section is what we call Table of Casualties. And that's a very interesting section too. The Winona, there usually is an entry in the table of casualties and in the services of crews for every call. There are 2 entries for each. So here we have the account of the Winona, and it says 1 mile northwest of the station, at the Ship Canal Station, the schooner Winona of Buffalo, New York. The master was Davis. She was 496 gross tons. She was bound from Hancock, Michigan to Ashland, Wisconsin. She was worth $9,000. She was a total loss. There were 6 persons on board who were saved, and 6 people were afforded succor at the station. No lives lost. And so you get a lot of good detail in these tables here, because it'll identify which vessel it was specifically, and it'll tell you where it happened with great accuracy. That's how we know where this accident was. So these are some important resources. These call tables are quite long too. These casualty tables. There are a lot of accidents, and they're broken down by district. So this one is just District 10, which is Lake Huron and Superior in this instance. And you can see there are page after page after page of a vessel accident that the life-saving service went on. So an excellent resource. I hope that you're able to make use of this someday. I have a full run myself, and I'm happy to do lookups for people. But these are obtainable as well. If you wanted to build your own collection of these, it's not outside the realm of possibility. They're an excellent resource, and many of them are on the market at any one time. In fact, I have some duplicates, so I may be interested in selling those to the right person if a researcher wanted them. So thank you very much for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it, and stay safe and don't get the virus. Thanks, everybody.